I want to begin just by thanking our hosts and organizers for the invitation to be here at the University of Santa Croce for this opportunity this morning, today, and tomorrow to reflect on the many meanings of work: religious, economic, social, political, and cultural in this 500th anniversary year of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation and the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, as we acknowledge the respective historical significance of the years 1517 and 1917. My particular task this morning is to offer some remarks about Protestantism and Catholicism in relationship to work, seen in historical perspective. I will do this by taking a longer-term approach, beginning with a few reflections on Christianity and work in history more generally, and about Christian commentary about work prior to the Protestant Reformation. I take my inspiration, my cue, from the perspective that is implicit in the most substantial papal document devoted specifically to work and its theological and human significance in the modern era, namely Saint Pope John Paul II's Laborem Exercens, his encyclical written in 1981 for another commemoration, the 90th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. Considering the centrality of human work to human life, regardless of the historical period or civilization in question, from the time of the domestication of animals and settled agriculture several thousand years ago up to the present, what most strikes me is how relatively little serious theological reflection has been dedicated to the subject per se in the history of Christianity. It really is quite remarkable. At the most basic level, without some forms of sustained work, human beings die. Even in the most elementary expressions of foraging for food, or hunting, or fishing, labor is indispensable to human survival, and therefore a prerequisite for the possibility of human flourishing en route to the ultimate human goal of beatitudo with God. This fundamental character of work has marked every society and every culture since ancient times. As Pope John Paul II writes in Laborem Exercens, quote, "Work is part of what is old as man and his life on earth, including as it does, quote, any activity by man, whether manual or intellectual, whatever its nature or circumstances," unquote. In most, if not all eras, and in most human societies throughout history, most people have spent most of their waking hours working. So prima facie, we might reasonably think that an activity in which, in its many expressions and in the variety of forms it has assumed, most Christians have spent most of their time would have inspired a rich tradition of theological reflection. We might reasonably have thought there were substantive, serious treatises and an insightful homiletic or catechetical tradition addressing questions such as, how do human beings follow Christ in their ordinary daily work? Or, in what ways is the activity of a man working in the fields a woman running a household, or an artisan weaving wool, or cobbling shoes, or hammering nails related to the gospel. But there seems not to be such a tradition. Despite the seeming obviousness of the importance of work in human life, daily labor in whatever capacity, it is not a theme that seems to have been taken up per se in a sustained way for theological reflection in the early church, among the church fathers, or in medieval monasticism or scholasticism. The readers of Laborum Exercens might be forgiven for having received a different impression. In his encyclical, Pope John Paul II briefly offers a historical picture about the impact of Christianity on the character of human labor in the ancient Mediterranean world, which in the first century, of course, was under the political sway of the Roman Empire. From what he says, it sounds as though Christianity brought about a revolution in the understanding of human labor. And here's a quotation from Laborum Exercens. The ancient world introduced its own typical differentiation of people into classes according to the type of work done. Work which demanded from the worker the exercise of physical strength, the work of muscles and hands, was considered unworthy of free men and was therefore given to slaves. By broadening certain aspects that already belonged to the Old Testament, Christianity brought about a fundamental change of ideas in this field, taking the whole content of the gospel message as its point of departure, especially the fact that the one who, while being God, became like us in all things, devoted most of the years of his life on earth to manual work at the carpenter's bench. Such a concept practically does away with the very basis of the ancient differentiation of people into classes according to the kind of work done. Now, in principle, perhaps, but certainly not in practice, were traditional ancient categories broken down by the divine condescension that simultaneously ennobled simple, humble work as modeled by Jesus, whether in the decades after Christ's death and resurrection, while Christianity was still a fledgling but growing movement in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, or after Constantine gave his imperial stamp of approval to Christianity in the 2nd decade of the 4th century, or once Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the empire in the year 380. Imperial support for Christianity did not alter the deeply hierarchical character of the Roman Empire in socioeconomic terms, including the persistence of slavery, nor indeed did the Christianization of medieval Europe, whether during the missionary endeavors of Benedictines in the 6th through the 10th centuries, or after the Gregorian Revolution of the 11th century. The presumptive fact that Jesus spent his adult young years in, quote, manual work at the carpenter's bench, unquote, prior to taking up his public ministry after his baptism by John the Baptist, was not something emphasized by patristic writers, who were preoccupied instead with the importance of Christ's ethical teachings and especially with the implications of the incarnation for human redemption, salvation, and the understanding of God. In this, they were only following the gospel narratives themselves, which say nothing about Jesus between the incident when his parents find him at age 12 teaching in the temple in Jerusalem, mentioned in Luke chapter 2, and his exposure to the preaching of John the Baptist years later. Christ as simple craftsman, as humble, laboring carpenter, is incidental, if not irrelevant, to the development of Christology and moral theology in the early and medieval church. Now, I am well aware that papal encyclicals are not works of historical scholarship. And although I am a historian, it would be wrong-headed for me to expect papal encyclicals to be works of historical scholarship. Yet, at the same time, it is important to the faith that what encyclicals say about the past not be mistaken, and it is preferable that they not be misleading. It seems to me that Laborem Exercens is misleading in the way that it implies that a personalist understanding of human beings, in which, for every person, the purpose of work is, quote, to realize his humanity, to fulfill the calling to be a person that is his by reason of his very humanity, unquote, was something achieved by the advent of Christianity itself with respect to work, and has characterized either the Church's teaching or the Christian tradition more broadly, from the ancient world to the modern era, through its emphasis on the human subject and the primary importance of the subjective character of work, because, again quoting from the encyclical, the one who carries it out is a person, a conscious and free subject, that is to say, a subject that decides about himself. Section 7 of the encyclical opens with this sentence, quote, "It is precisely these fundamental affirmations about work that always emerged from the wealth of Christian truth, especially from the very message of the gospel of work, thus creating the basis for a new way of thinking, judging, and acting," unquote. Now, one might interpret this statement by distinguishing between creating a basis for a new way of thinking, judging, and acting, as opposed actually to thinking, judging, and acting in new ways. But it seems to me that this is about as far as one can go with Pope John Paul II's assertion. The very next sentence of the encyclical jumps all the way to the modern period and the forms of materialistic and economistic thought that accompanied the industrial era, which are, to be sure, incompatible with traditional Christian flourishing. But there is almost nothing in the encyclical about the first 17 centuries of Christian history, between the advent of the gospel's supposed revolution in the conceptualization of labor and the Industrial Revolution. That includes, in between there, the Protestant Reformation. The Industrial Revolution indeed did bring about a massive transformation of human society, beginning in Britain at the end of the 18th century and spreading to other European countries and North America in the 19th. The associated disruptions led eventually to the Church's attempts to address radically new social and economic conditions, including new forms of industrial labor in modern Catholic social teaching, beginning with Rerum Novarum and influenced in preceding decades of the 19th century by theologians such as Archbishop Wilhelm Emanuel von Kettler of Mainz. There are no references to patristic sources in Laborem Exercens, nor do any of the 4 references to Thomas Aquinas' works in the encyclical concern labor in a substantive or direct way. I am more than willing to defer to those who know more about the subject of pre-modern Catholic theological and spiritual reflection about human labor, and I would actually be thrilled to learn of the existence of such a tradition and to be directed to the relevant sources. We can find scattered remarks in the Church Fathers about labor that can be seen as compatible with what Laborem Exercens says about the ennobling, transformative character of labor rooted in Jesus' work as a carpenter. St. John Chrysostom writes in a homily on 1 Corinthians, for example, that when you, quote, see one driving nails, smiting with a hammer, covered with soot, do not therefore hold him cheap, but rather for that reason admire him, since even Peter girded himself and handled the dragnet and went fishing after the resurrection of the Lord. St. Augustine states that, quote, the Apostle Paul would not refuse to perform any rustic labor or to engage in any workman's craft. And more generally, quote, whatever work men perform without guilt or trickery is good. There are other remarks, too, that fit better with what John Paul emphasizes at the end of his encyclical, which seem to me more representative of the preponderant emphasis about the theological significance and spiritual meaning of work throughout most of the history of Christianity. This tradition sees in human labor less the deliberate development of God-given human capacities and realization of human personhood than an opportunity for co-suffering with Christ through the patient endurance of taxing toil. Hence, for example, St. Basil says that, quote, it is obvious that we must toil with diligence and not think our goal of piety offers an escape from work or a pretext for idleness, but occasion for struggle, for even greater endeavor, and for patience in tribulation, so that we may be able to say, in labor and painfulness, in much watching, in hunger and thirst. An allusion here at the end to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. The rule of St. Benedict, a school of service to the Lord, as the prologue puts it, shaped a monastic tradition known for prayer and work, ora et labora. There is certainly a strong emphasis on the importance of good works inspired by Scripture and geared toward the imitation of Christ throughout the rule, most explicitly in the 72 instruments of the spiritual art in chapter 4. Yet despite the importance of manual labor in monastic life, the terse, flexible rule of St. Benedict includes very little commentary on or theological reflection about it. Chapter 47, devoted to manual labor, begins on the same note as the quotation from St. Basil mentioned before. Quote, idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brothers should be occupied at certain times in manual labor and at other fixed hours in holy reading. The remainder of the chapter is given mostly to recommended allotments of time to be devoted to each type of activity at different times of the day throughout the major divisions of the liturgical year. There is nothing at all about the meaning or purpose of work beyond the avoidance of idleness. Elsewhere, the rule stipulates that except for reasons of illness or another pressing matter, quote, no one be excused from duty in the kitchen, for thereby a very great award is obtained. Yet there is no further comment about what that reward might be. Clearly, he wasn't sampling Roman cuisine. Then we would have known what the reward was. Chapter 57 on the craftsman in the monastic community mentions the danger of pride and little else. Let them exercise their crafts with all humility and reverence. But if one of them grows proud because of the knowledge of his craft, in that he seemed to confer some benefit on the monastery, let such a one be taken away from this craft and not practiced it again, unless perchance, after he has humbled himself, the abbot may bid him resume it. Taken together, it seems fair to say that these prescriptions and warnings are not oriented toward labor as a central means of realizing one's humanity, except insofar as it helps one avoid idleness and practice the self-discipline essential to those seeking to follow Christ, quote, by the labor of obedience to him from whom you have departed by the sloth of disobedience, unquote. What about St. Thomas Aquinas? Surely, in the breadth of the Summa Theologiae, we may think, there must be some substantive analysis of labor, considering its centrality in the lives of his 13th century Christian contemporaries, including in bustling cities such as Cologne and Paris, where the angelic doctor studied and taught. In one sense, of course, much of what Aquinas says in his exhaustive analysis of human acts, in his treatment of virtues and vices, can be applied in a generic way to the human acts involved in work, regardless of one's occupation or the type of labor involved. But it is striking that the Summa includes no substantive consideration of labor per se. In the Secunda Secundae, after 170 questions on the 3 theological and the 4 cardinal virtues, Aquinas devotes 11 questions to different types and states of life. Not one concerns lay life per se, nor are any dedicated to a state of life that involves manual labor. The traditional distinction between the contemplative and the active lives, rooted in the gospel story of Mary and Martha, serves as a basis for analyzing the relative merits of religious and ecclesiastical life that focus respectively on contemplation and action. St. Thomas was certainly aware of the reality of physical work outside religious life. He notes that, quote, under manual labor are comprised all those human occupations whereby man can lawfully gain a livelihood, whether by using his hands, his feet, or his tongue, unquote. But active life is not extended to include any explicit consideration of anyone who grew the crops, tended the sheep, sheared the wool, wove the cloth, cut the trees, fashioned the furniture, constructed the wagons, harvested the grapes, made the wine, dug and maintained the wells, cut and hauled the stone, laid and mortared the bricks, and constructed the buildings, or any of the other forms of labor that surrounded Aquinas and other 13th century university professors, and on which their own lives depended in crucial ways. Again, despite 11 questions about the ecclesiastical and the religious states, there is no discussion of the lay state of Christian life. Status is analyzed fundamentally according to the distinction between freedom and servitude, and with respect to internal and external acts considered as such. That's in the Secunda Secundae, question 183. Aquinas' most explicit remarks in the Summa on manual labor, per se, are found in the Secunda Secundae, question 187, article 3, when he is addressing whether the members of religious orders are bound to practice manual labor. So in other words, even here, the mention of labor is indirect and oblique in relationship to another question. Here, St. Thomas says that manual labor is directed toward 4 things. Above all, and chiefly, to the obtaining of food. He refers, as do many other pre-modern commentators, to Genesis 3, verse 19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. As well as the second reason he mentions, combating idleness. We saw it also with Saints Basil and Benedict. Then to curbing concupiscence through disciplining and occupying the body. And finally, to obtaining provisions for almsgiving. The first of the 4, we have to have money, right? We work so we can get extra money so we can give it away. As always, Aquinas makes sense. He really does always make sense. Apologies to Scotus in the crowd. He usually makes sense too, but I'm not going to go there. The first of these 4, the first of the 4, chiefly to the obtaining of food, is a matter of necessity insofar as human beings cannot live without food. The other 3, though, are not necessary insofar as their ends can be obtained by means other than work. So without belaboring the point, it seems fair to say that what Aquinas says about work, human labor per se, is minimal, indirect, mostly abstract, not theologically expansive, and quite distant from the exalted terms in which John Paul II describes work, and in which we might think labor had been regarded during the history of the Church based on what laborem exercens implies about the gospel of work following the advent of Christianity. Now, a brief presentation like this one cannot claim anything like comprehensiveness, of course, but I suspect that expanding the range of sources would reinforce the impression conveyed by those I have cited about the impoverished character of theological reflection on and writing about the spiritual significance of human work as such for most of the history of the Catholic tradition. Again, unless others know of important, numerous sources I have overlooked, there is nothing in the ancient, medieval, or even, as we will see, the early modern church comparable to the deliberate, self-conscious awareness of and reflection on labor that is characteristic of modern Catholic social teaching, from Rerum Novarum through the documents of Vatican II, Laborem Exercens, and other papal encyclicals through Pope Francis's Laudato Si. The substantive beginnings of this more positive theological reflection, it seems to me, might be attributed to some Renaissance humanist writers, such as Giannozzo Manetti in Florence or Benedetto Morandi in Bologna, neither of whom were trained theologians, but both of whom expressed more positive, constructive ideas about human work than much of the preceding tradition as part of their Renaissance view of human beings. Perhaps the fact that Jesus was a carpenter and that work is addressed in various ways in Scripture provided the basis for a Christian revolution in the understanding of work. If so, it seems not to have expressed itself very robustly in the early or medieval church. That prompts the question, why not? Why was work regarded as a hedge against idleness, a bridle against concupiscence, and chiefly as a means of acquiring food, but not as a path to human fulfillment or self-realization along the lines implied by Pope John Paul II's personalism? I suspect the principal reason is the obvious one, namely that for most work, for most people in pre-modern history, it was grueling, repetitive, and unfulfilling agricultural labor. It was heavily dependent on the vagaries of weather, susceptible to crop failures, and heavily influenced by diseases that adversely affected flocks of sheep, goats, and other animals, as part of human life lived close to the rhythms of the natural world and always subject to the possibility of subsistence crises. Ancient, medieval, and early modern Europe was not a world in which most men, let alone women, had much choice about what they wanted to do with their lives. It was not a world in which most people, and again, women far less than men, had the opportunity for formal education, something rightly emphasized in modern Catholic social teaching as critical for the development of human beings' God-given gifts, or, as Laborem Exercens puts it, as something that is, quote, always valuable and an important enrichment of the human person. For becoming a human being is precisely the main purpose of the whole process of education. It stands to reason, then, that there was not much Christian reflection about what understandably was not regarded as a crucial path to human fulfillment, and that instead work was understood in ways in which its commonly negative, punitive, unpleasant terms found their positive meaning in a sense different from the one emphasized in the encyclical. That does not imply, of course, that labor was without value or went unredeemed, but rather that its principal connotations for most Christians, to the extent they reflected on the matter, would have been more along the lines of what Pope John Paul mentions only at the very end of Laborem Exercens, a matter of suffering and of co-suffering with the Savior, quote, by enduring the toil of work in union with Christ crucified for us. As the encyclical states, a Christian, quotes, shows himself a true disciple of Christ by carrying the cross in his turn every day in the activity that he is called upon to perform, unquote. This understanding presumably would have applied less to that minority of medieval and early modern men in towns who did have the opportunity to exercise their creativity and freedom as artisans, jurists, or teachers, members of other occupations, despite the constraints characteristic of their institutional contexts, laws, and customs. But lives of unchosen, grueling, hard labor, whether in pre-modern Europe or today, tend to lend themselves to a Christian experience and understanding of work as suffering and co-suffering, more than to a notion in which, through work, a Christian realizes the person God wills him or her to become through the gradual fulfillment of a freely chosen vocation. I have not forgotten that I am supposed to say something about the Protestant Reformation. But now I have arrived at the point where it makes sense to do so. One of the ironies of Laborum Exercens is that in its esteem for human work of all kinds, including those that are the preserve of lay Christians, it is, in a sense, knowingly or not, the theological heir to a tradition that began in an influential way with Martin Luther. In the pre-modern world, dominated still by agricultural labor and characterized by artisanal crafts in the growing towns of early 16th century Europe, Luther spoke forcefully of the spiritual value of ordinary labor as part of his polemic against pious actions or works, understood as contributions to the Christian process of salvation. This was one corollary of his new theology of faith, grace, and salvation. As he says in his treatise on good works from the spring of 1520, God, quote, is served by everything, whatever it may be, that is done, spoken, or conceived in faith. The key, according to Luther, is faith and the feeling of certainty that in his experience accompanies it. This was what sanctified work and made it pleasing to God, regardless of what sort of work it was. Quote, all individuals are able to tell and feel whether or not what they do is good, he wrote in the same treatise. Quote, if their hearts are confident that their work is pleasing to God, then it is good, even if it were something as trivial as picking up a straw. Still, Luther's revaluation of the place of human labor in Christian life and of its theological significance, regardless of the particular forms it takes, is more nearly related to his rejection of the distinction between the clergy and laity as traditionally understood. It is a corollary of Luther's priesthood of all believers and his sanctification of lay life, placing it fully on the same plane alongside that of the clergy, a view that was not officially and forcefully articulated in Catholicism until Lumen Gentium during Vatican II. This position is expressed powerfully by Luther in his even more polemical treatise of 1520 to the Christian nobility of the German nation. There he says, in deliberately provocative fashion, not only that, quote, a cobbler, a blacksmith, a peasant, each has the work and office of his trade, but also that, quote, they are all alike consecrated priests and bishops, and everyone should benefit and serve everyone else by means of their own work or office, so that in this way, many kinds of work may be done for the bodily and spiritual welfare of the community, just as all the members of the body serve one another, unquote. Luther's view of clerical ordination and status, as well as his rejection of the monastic life in which he had taken vows and lived for more than 10 years, are of course incompatible with the Catholic position that was strongly reaffirmed by the Council of Trent and has been reaffirmed since. But his unabashed exaltation of ordinary lay labor as such started something new in Western Christianity, an emphasis that complemented Renaissance humanism from a theologically more explicit, yet anthropologically much more pessimistic starting point. Something analogous could be said about John Calvin, with his strong sense of Christian vocatio that applied equally but differently to clergy and laity, men and women, yet with a supple adaptability lacking in Luther's view that Christians ought to stay in the occupations in which they found themselves. The survival and the institutionalization of the Reformation in both its Lutheran and Reformed Protestant forms in different regions in Europe brought those ways of thinking about Protestant lay people and Christian labor into the modern era. Catholicism in the 16th century was characterized by a new attention to Christian vocation also, and by what is often called discernment. This was significant for human labor because different sorts of work tended to accompany different vocations. Here, the influence of Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises is almost impossible to overstate, considering how widely they were administered and adaptively practiced. And as a matter of sheer numbers, it seems obvious that the discernment process of the large majority of those who made the exercises resulted not in the exercitants becoming Jesuits, which after all was not the purpose of the exercises, but rather, although the Jesuits' enemies thought that it was, but rather becoming more self-conscious, spiritually self-aware members of the laity. That said, the thrust of the exercises is not on labor per se, but rather on the discernment of God's will for one's state in life, whether clerical or married, as the means to the sole end, quote, the praise of God our Lord, and for the salvation of my soul. The Ignatian emphasis on discernment certainly had a major influence on the reflective self-deliberation of Catholics about vocation, more of whom, like their Protestant contemporaries, were also becoming better educated in larger numbers in the 16th century. But we do not find in the spiritual exercises, it seems to me, as much reflection on or attribution of spiritual meaning to work per se, applicable to all its forms, as we do in Luther or Calvin. What about the great French devotional writer and doctor of the Catholic Church who was so influenced by Ignatian spirituality and education himself, Saint François de Sales? Famously, his introduction to the devout life, in a manner quite unlike the more traditionally monastic 15th century imitation of Christ, for example, emphasizes the compatibility of serious Christian devotion, focused on the love of God and neighbor with every station and vocation in life. In chapter 3 of book 1, entitled Devotion is Suitable to Every Vocation and Profession, de Sales writes that God bids Christians, quote, to bring forth fruits of devotion, each one according to his kind and vocation. A different exercise of devotion is required of each: the noble, the artisan, the servant, the prince, the maiden, and the wife. And furthermore, such practice must be modified according to the strength, the calling, and the duties of each individual. Relatedly, later in the same chapter, he writes, quote, "It is an error, nay more, a very heresy, to seek to banish the devout life from the soldier's guardroom, the mechanic's workshop, the prince's court, or the domestic's hearth." We can see in this universal adaptability of devotion to every human occupation and calling a sort of Catholic response to Luther's priesthood of all believers, an emphasis on the sacred character of lay work in the world. Yet the emphasis seems to me subtly different. The focus of Francois de Sales' introduction to the devout life is not work, and the treatise does not offer a theological reflection on the meaning or spiritual significance of human labor. The focus of the treatise is devotion, understood properly as the love of God realized as fully as possible. And his emphasis is the compatibility of devotion with all types of Christian callings. You can and should be holy and find your appropriate way of loving God and others, regardless of whether you are doing housework or teaching students or selling textiles. De Sales emphasizes devotion. Ignatius concentrates on discernment, but neither says much about human labor as such. Certainly not with anything like the deliberateness or to the extent or in the terms that Pope St. John Paul II reflects on it in Laborem Exercens. As I move toward a conclusion, I want to repeat that these brief remarks are offered as a provisional, impressionistic account, remarks that are not and cannot be comprehensive. And again, I know others are much more learned in matters pertaining to the theological meaning of work in the history of the Catholic and Protestant traditions. Accordingly, my concluding reflections are also tentative. That said, it seems that it is only in modern Catholic social teaching, beginning in the 19th century and first expressed with a magisterial gravitas in Rerum Novarum, that we find a serious, robust Catholic reflection on the theological significance of work per se. If that is true, it seems unlikely that the reason for the appearance of these ideas derived from theological reflection on the gospel message as such, or from the fact that Jesus was a humble carpenter, or biblical passages and parables that mention work, or different ancient occupations, and so forth. That message, Jesus' work, and those biblical passages had been there for over 1,800 years. That leads me to suspect that human labor per se finally became a focus for Catholic theology when it did, beginning really in the 19th century, not for reasons internal to theological reflection, but above all because of the enormous changes that were wrought by the Industrial Revolution. Technological innovation and the creation of wealth made possible new human possibilities that hitherto had been unimaginable, and made it increasingly realistic to think about more forms of human work as desirable, as interesting, and as fulfilling, rather than as repetitive drudgery. At the same time, the concentration of the new wealth in the hands of a small number of rich entrepreneurs, while large numbers of factory workers labored in new forms of soul-crushing and physically dangerous drudgery posed new problems for traditional Catholic theological questions about justice. What now was the common good? How should wealth best be distributed to pursue it realistically? Did increasing affluence and aspirations for material comfort mark an intrinsic threat to the ascetic self-denial central to Christ's message and to the tradition? How were states that protected individual rights and fostered education for more and more citizens to be leveraged for the pursuit of flourishing of all members of society, rather than becoming the mechanisms for the enrichment of the few and the impoverishment of the many? The theological meaning of labor and prospects for thinking in terms of choice, fulfillment, and the realization of one's talents and humanity emerged within Catholicism less for internal theological reasons, as they did in Protestantism beginning in the 16th century, than for reasons inspired by the radically changed social and economic realities brought about by 19th century industrialization in Europe. These questions about wealth and its distribution, social justice, human flourishing, and the common good are, broadly speaking, the ones that remain with us today, and of course constitute the core concerns of modern Catholic social teaching from Rerum Novarum through Laudato Si. We encounter them today not in their 19th century forms, of course, but in ways that have been extended, globalized, and transformed by more recent revolutions in communications, mobility, and economic policy and practice. It seems to me that different theological meanings of work for both Catholics and Protestants remain alive and well today, and that the principal ways in which Christians across denominational lines make sense of work tend to be shaped partly by the kind of work they do, the situations in which they find themselves, and the opportunities they either have or do not have. Pope John Paul II's beautiful vision of the primacy of the subjective meaning of work and of the way in which, through education and freedom and dedication, one incrementally realizes the potential to become the person God has called one to be, is likely to make most sense to those who are in objective situations of political stability, socioeconomic opportunity, sustained education, and job security. By contrast, the Latin American immigrants who work long hours in backbreaking labor, picking fruit and vegetables in the United States, as well as the millions of men, women, and children who work in the factories in China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other countries to make so many of the things that wealthy Westerners buy. These people, I suspect, would be more likely to identify with labor as the toil through which we suffer with Christ, and Christ suffers with us, his passion dignifying and redeeming our suffering. And finally, the profound job uncertainty and instability in recent years created by the combination of neoliberal economic policies and ever-increasing levels of manufacturing automation has perhaps created the conditions for yet another spirituality of Christian work, one focused perhaps less on the personalist realization of a stable vocation than on a renewed awareness of one's life, including one's own work life, as a peregrinatio, a pilgrimage in which the final goal is clear, but not the path one will take to get there. A journey in solidarity with Jesus, the Son of Man who had nowhere to lay his head in this life. All three of these basic meanings of work, I think, along with others, are legitimate, understandable, and applicable to Christians' lives today, depending partly on the circumstances in which they find themselves. They are reminders of the one who is always with us and who sustains and supports us regardless of the work we do and how we do it. Thank you.